So I have the distinct honor for introducing Dr. Darwin Baluran. So Darwin did his PhD in sociology from Vanderbilt University. He joined Ohio State 2 years ago, right? Just exactly around 2 years ago. And shares his time between Glenn College and the Darwin Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. His research focuses on public health, criminology, and policing. He has published already in very well-known, well-known journals. And this coming fall, I think he's going to be leaving us and joining Washington University in the Department of Sociology as an assistant professor. So with that, Darwin.
Thanks, Russell. Thanks everyone for coming. I know we're competing with the equipment. So as I was thinking about like what to talk about for
It's not. I wondered if that was intentional. Maybe we're like saving back up.
Cool. Yes, as I was thinking about what to talk about today, I realized that this colloquium kind of falls with during Asian Pacific Islander, that's the American Heritage Month. So I decided that instead of going sort of our traditional colloquium talk where I'm going to go into detail on a specific study, I instead wanted to kind of take the time to talk a little bit sort of about the broader sort of issues sort of surrounding research and people of Asian descent, and particularly this idea of sort of researchers and sort of the general public kind of clumping all Asian descent people into a monolithic category. And so that's sort of why I titled this, partitioning the monolith, that is sort of breaking apart that sort of monolithic idea. And so before I go on, just kind of a brief overview of what I'll be talking about. I'll briefly talk about some of the goals for this presentation, and then I'll discuss some of the important context of why it's important to study people with Asian descent. And then I'll talk a little bit about sort of the state of research on this population. And there I'll highlight some findings from my own work over the past few years, sort of looking at sort of hidden inequalities among Asians and Asian Americans. And then I'll just end by talking about sort of directions for research that I think are promising, and I'll highlight some, I think, resources that would be useful for researchers that publicly accessible, things like that. That might help us sort of address problems. So I hope to accomplish three things today. First is I want to give you sort of a brief overview of sort of historical factors that have really shaped sort of the demography of Asians and Asian Americans in the United States. And I'll spend some time on this. I think it's important because if you grew up in the United States, we're really sort of not taught in school about history, right, of people of Asian descent in this country. And so I think unless you really sort of focus on this sort of area of research, it's something that's rarely talked about. And then again, I'll talk about the research and identify sort of areas for the future. So just a little bit about me. As Dr. Hassan mentioned, I'm a sociologist by training, and my research kind of falls into sort of one of these like three big buckets, right? So as a sociologist of race, I'm really interested in questions about, like what race means, how do people sort of draw boundaries of their racial groups, and like the implications of racism on people's life outcomes. And one of the key areas of those outcomes that I really am interested in looking at is thinking about health, right? So social factors that influence health, particularly sort of at the population level. And then another outcome that I'm really interested in is thinking about in sociology called social control, which is kind of related to criminology, policing, and sort of the different factors that shape how people make contact with the criminal legal system. And so in my work, if you do a quick like Google Scholar search, you'll notice right away that in most of the top journals in those different areas, you rarely ever see sort of research that focuses on people of Asian descent. And so that's kind of one of the reasons that I went to graduate school, saying, okay, this is a big problem that we need to address. And so this is one of the key questions that I think about a lot in my work, right? So what can the experiences of Asian descent people teach us about how race operates in American society? And I think this is a question that I want you all to kind of keep in the back of your mind as I'm going through this presentation. So just for context, right, why should we study people of Asian descent in the US? According to census data, they are the fastest growing racial group in the country. Right now, depending on how you measure sort of racial groups, there's about between 20 or 24 million people of Asian descent in the United States. And they're projected to sort of double in size by the year 2060, right? What's also interesting about the Asian population is they're also the only racial group in the United States where the majority of the people are actually foreign born. So something like 90% of all Asian descent people in the US are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. Right. And so, when we often think about immigration, for example, because we often think of the Filipinos or Hispanic as sort of the quintessential immigrant group, right? But when you're thinking about this, right, like Asian people of Asian descent should actually be part of that conversation, right? They're also the fastest growing immigrant group. But sort of more related to this conversation today, people of Asian descent are also a very diverse group of people, right? So this figure that I have here is from the American Community Survey and the US Census data. And of the 20 or 24 million people of Asian descent in the US, there are really sort of six sort of key groups that make up that population, right? So you have Chinese, Asian Indians, Filipinos, Vietnamese, Koreans, and Japanese. And then the other group kind of combines all the smaller sort of racial and ethnic groups subsumed under Asian or Asian American. Right, but so even if we're just looking though at these six sort of major categories, they have very different histories, right? Different languages, different cultures. So when people arrive to the United States, they're sort of flattened, right? And so the problem that that I want to address with my work is what kinds of information gets lost when we clump people and flatten their differences. So how did we get right to sort of this clumping of people of Asian descent in the US? So I think it's important to first think about just some key historical events that got us here. Historians will tell us that really sort of the first major sort of mass migration of people from Asia to the US was around 1849. So this is when we had people, workers from southern China who sort of were moved to the western part of the country, places like California, Oregon, Washington State. And most of them were sort of brought there as indentured servants to work in farming and mining and of course the railroads, right? And because they were brought into the United States as sort of a cheap source of labor, it didn't take very long for them to start sort of facing a lot of racial violence. Not only from sort of the white majority in the United States, but also from sort of other new immigrant minority groups in the country, right? And so by 1882, this sort of culminated, right, then to the sort of implementation of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was really sort of the first major sort of piece of immigration policy in the US that specifically sort of targeted the exclusion, right, of a particular like sort of national origin group. And then, so the Chinese Exclusion Act basically barred the movement of people, sort of workers from China coming to the United States. And then following that, we started seeing sort of even more restrictive policies that, for example, by 1924, the United States sort of implemented national origin quotas. And part of that law basically said that the US will only give immigration visas to people based on different quotas, and the quota was set at 2% of the population of those national origins in the US based on the 80s and 90s census. And so that kind of virtually prohibits the migration most non-European migrants to the US. And then of course, sort of going forward to the 20th century, we again saw sort of another form of violence, which was the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. But one of the key sort of really important policies that really shaped, I think, sort of race and the demographics of this country was the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, right? So that law basically tried to sort of remove the immigration quotas that were set in the 1920s, and it really kind of opened the door to sort of a new wave of mass migration to the United States, and in particular, mass migration of people coming from Asia. And so, when historians talk about sort of history of Asians and Asian Americans, I think they will say, you kind of think about it as sort of three sort of phases. There's this 1849 to about 1882, and then there's sort of part in the middle up to 1965, and then now we're in the post 1965 world, right? But throughout this long history, people of Asian descent have always kind of faced sort of issues about how sort of the government and sort of the majority of the United States kind of categorize them, right? And so the first census in the US was in 1790, but the first time we actually see an Asian group being put in the census in 1870. So this is when the census included Chinese as a color or race category. And then as you move forward, as more immigrant groups kind of came to the US, the US kind of added more and more sort of categories to the census. So like looking at the 1940 census, they added Hindu, which was really in reference to South Asians and Asian Indians, they just combined them. And what's also interesting was like both pre-1960s census sort of racial categories were actually sort of assigned by the census taker, so you don't get to sort of self-identify. That's what the person receives. And then also notable here, right? They separated in Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, Hindus, different races. So it's not until 1990 that the census actually sort of explicitly categorizes these different groups as sort of Asian Pacific Islander racial category. And then, the 2020 census, we started to see, right? So here, this is sort of the Asian group, but you can see here, they also combine, Pacific Islanders. And then I think the White House recently their 2030 census categories. It's notable here, actually. Here, I think they did separate the Asian categories from the international categories. Then they also added sort of Hispanic, Latino, and Middle East students as sort of their own racial ethnic groups. But I point out those different sort of categorizations in the census to kind of get at this idea, right, of like what race means. I think when you first sort of think about like what is race, people often think it's just your skin color, it's just a label. But even just looking at this sort of historical overview of the census, you see that race is like a very blurry concept in sort of in practice. And so scholars of race will say that maybe you can think of race as really more of a marker of like shared histories or shared sort of life experiences, right? But again, this idea of sort of how you group people into different racial categories is very, very consistent and kind of incoherent throughout US history. That has implications for how to think about sort of Asian parents. So again, to kind of get at that idea, we can even go back again in time and think about how different Asian groups in the US were sort of racialized and how they experienced sort of violence and exclusion, right? So in that sort of pre-20th century era, the largest Asian group in the US were people of Chinese descent, and they faced really sort of a lot of racial violence, right? And then during that period in our history, there was really this sort of portrayal of Chinese people in particular as sort of the yellow peril, right? They're sort of like the yellow danger. And so during this period, Chinese and Chinese Americans were sort of perceived as like harbingers of disease, and people, sort of immigrants, were taking away jobs, that they were dangerous, they were immoral, right? And so these are cartoons from that era, showing sort of the violence, right, that people sort of experience. For example, in the middle, this is actually an ad for a cleaner, right? And it said, if you use their cleaner, like you'll get rid of dirt. And it's a picture of Uncle Sam kicking a Chinese person, right? And then there's an image there of what would be the Statue of Liberty, but replaced by like a Chinese person, right? So this idea that Chinese people were coming to sort of take over the United States. But then in sort of the 20th century, we also see different groups sort of experiencing different types of violence. So in the 1930s, for example, in California, there was a big sort of Filipino population, and during that time, Filipinos were sort of seen as sort of brown men who were sort of sexually immoral, and they were there to sort of get at the white women. And so there was a riot in Northern California called the Watsonville riots that was actually caused by there used to be sort of dance halls, and there were these Filipino men who were dancing in the dance halls with white women, and people got angry in the community, and so it turned into a riot that led to sort of killing Filipinos. And then by the time we get to sort of near World War II, you know, we see, right, the sort of focus of violence and racism became sort of Japanese Americans. And I put up this Life magazine article, so I think it's interesting because it kind of shows how people thought about race and the differences, right, between different Asian groups here. So this is a Life magazine article that says this is how you can tell a Japanese person from a Chinese person. And they, you know, and it's kind of hard to see, but they actually talk about like, oh, you know, different proportions in their facial features, like that's how you can tell like they're different, right? Well, Japanese are the enemy. And then obviously that kind of rhetoric led them to the incarceration of people, right? They were seen as sort of disloyal to the US. But so this period, really up until like the 1960s, were different in terms of how people of Asian descent were racialized, because really until like the 1960s and later, we really kind of talked about Asian descent people as sort of separate groups, right? They're not considered one race. But then by the 1960s and like the civil rights movement and a lot of student activism, especially in places like UC Berkeley and San Francisco State University, we started to see the formation of what now is called Asian or Asian American like racial identity. And the formation of this identity is interesting because it's in many ways it's really sort of a racial formation on the inside, right? It's not sort of people not part of the group that are sort of saying like this is for racial category. It's these were Chinese American students, Japanese American students saying, hey, like we should create a new racial identity. And the idea behind that was that during this time, right, there's a lot of political upheaval in the United States. And even though there were a lot of Asian descent people in the US, if you look at them sort of disaggregated by groups, they were too small in number to really have sort of meaningful like, impact in terms of like, politics. And so the idea was that if we created this sort of Asian American category, we sort of we get sort of power in numbers, right? And then obviously at the same time, also as we know, also following the mass migration of right, new people from Asia, we started seeing the development of the model minority, right? And this is sort of the idea that people of Asian descent kind of came to the US with nothing, and that because they're hard workers, they're intelligent, and all that stuff, that they were able to kind of succeed despite both racism. And this idea really was kind of became popular as a way to kind of drive a wedge between different sort of minority groups in the US, right? So at the same time it's just happening, right? Black and Latino people in the United States are saying like, hey, we need to change something about this country because it's very racially unjust. And so then the model minority myth kind of happens, and so people were saying, well, if these minority groups are able to succeed, why can't you? And so that really this idea of like Asian American identity and model minority myth are, I think, two really key ideas that continue to shape how we do research and talk about Asian descent people today. So this kind of brings us to the state of research in Asian American. As I noted earlier, really prior to like the 1960s, we kind of people in the US kind of thought about the different Asian groups as separate. But because of the popularization of like the Asian American kind of ethnic identity, the model minority myth, we started seeing sort of, especially in social science, actually this homogenization of different groups, right? And so rather than doing research on Japanese Americans or Chinese Americans, we started seeing more research on just Asian Americans as a whole. And in a lot of that work, really the frameworks that dominated in sort of how we thought about these studies was, things like the model minority stereotypes, right? That Asian Americans are successful, they're well educated. But there are also some folks who developed other theories to still point to the different experiences that Asians had in the US. So Claire Jean Kim's really influential theory of racial triangulation said that while Asian descent people are in one sense sort of valorized as model minorities, at the same time they're also sort of excluded as perpetual foreigners in the US. And so there's always this tension, right? As I noted earlier, much of the work that we see is really sort of focusing on Asian Americans and their successes as well as minorities. And that has led to many problems that many scholars, not just in social sciences, people in the humanities, and a lot of activists have argued that this sort of the dominant narratives about Asian descent people is very limited, right? And it's so it doesn't paint a full picture of their lived experiences. And so when we think about just existing data, there are really sort of three key problems that exist. First is just omission from existing data sets. If you look at large national level, surveys, for example, in the US, people of Asian descent may probably just not be included in there. There's also the problem of data aggregation, right? This idea of clumping them into one big category. And then the third problem is the problem of sort of extrapolation. Because we often rely on sort of data based on aggregated groups, sometimes researchers will make sort of conclusions about sort of subgroups based on findings from the larger groups or from the aggregated group, right? And that leads to sort of inaccuracies. So, for example, if we look at existing research on like health outcomes, you'll see that Asians as a whole live, have very long life expectancies. And I think often people kind of say that that means, a Vietnamese person might also have sort of similar outcomes, which I will show later is not the case. And so, Jennifer Lee and Vikram Krishna talked about this idea of like narrative scarcity, right? Even though there are plenty of stories of different Asian groups in the US, we focus on such narrow sort of stories about them, about their successes. And that has led to a lot of hidden inequalities. And that's kind of where I kind of position myself as a researcher. My goal really, especially right now, is to think about like how do we uncover these hidden inequalities that result from us sort of flattening people's experiences. So I'll provide just 4 examples from my work, kind of showing us what these hidden inequalities look like. As I noted earlier, one of the key areas I do research on is in looking at health outcomes. And so these are findings from a paper published in 2021 in Demography, where my co-author, Dr. Glenn Patterson, and I, we looked at data from the National Vital Statistics System, so all the recorded deaths in the United States for this period 2012 to 2016. And we used that data to create estimates of life expectancies at birth, right, for disaggregated subgroups in the US. And what's interesting with this paper is that these were very simple calculations, but this paper was actually the first to ever sort of give us disaggregated estimates for Asian groups in the US. And then we also did it for by census region of the country to see sort of what these inequalities look like. We're looking at the West, Northeast, South, things like that. But here, just looking at this, right, one of our key findings here. So the different colors, the darker colors are female, and then the lighter colors are males. And we look at the 6 largest Asian groups in the US. So, if you're looking at just the aggregated level, Asians and Asian Americans, right, you would see like, oh, they're very good life expectancies, right, doing very well. But when you disaggregate them, you see that groups like Vietnamese, there's almost a 10-year life expectancy gap there. And then I did put slides here for the sort of subgroup or sort of regional analyses. What we also found there was that we actually find that Asians who live in sort of the western states, western region of the US, such as California, actually have worse health outcomes than their counterparts in the South or the Northeast or the Midwest. And one of the we suspect one of the reasons for this is that regions outside of the Western US are sort of more new destinations for immigrants. And so there might be sort of positive selection that's happening there, right? So if you look at immigration literature, people who are sort of more likely to immigrate to new destinations are people who are less likely to have to rely on sort of their co-ethnic networks. So they might be higher education, higher skills. In the second example I give here, so I took that findings. Oh yeah.
Very interesting and important statistics.
Yeah.
Did your paper have data to further disaggregate the last slide by causes of death?
The data, that's one of the things we're working on. But yeah. So I'll talk about it a little bit here actually. It's hard to do it for like the small so groups like Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese. It's a little harder to disaggregate by cause of death because once you start to like go into smaller details, the CDC, what's the word? Yeah, you can't, right, I think it's too small. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question about the previous slide. But I want to know, like, what's like the first like the rates and like just general.
Yeah.
Because in my knowledge, that rate is similar to those who live in that country. and not those of the student. So, what's wondering.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we didn't include that here, but that's sort of another area I think for research to look at. But what we do know from the health literature is that immigrants, at least the first generation, tend to be healthier than their sort of US born counterparts. But by the time you get to like later generations, their health outcomes kind of worsen to match, general US population.
Learn all the bad habits.
Yeah, so that's probably what we would see. Yeah. But again, I look at.
Talking about.
Exactly. Right?
It's all that we get like the lack of activity.
It's like literally what we're doing.
I know, here, so I used to say the data here, but I kind of dragged it out to see what the trends have looked like over time. I only focus here on the three large groups, because I also wanted to kind of stratify them by educational attainment. So the different colors here are just the different sort of groups, right? So blues are Chinese, reds are Asian Indians, and then this kind of pink color is Filipinos. And then these are all the aggregated Asians in the US. And here I'm just showing sort of among males with no bachelor's degree. So what you see right from the 2005 to 2007 period to 2017 to 2019, we see like this widening inequality, especially you start to see sort of people Chinese descent kind of having this increasing advantage over Asian and Filipino counterparts. And so when we looked at when I looked at the sort of causes of death that might contribute to that, like one of the key things that I see is that we're starting to see sort of worsening cardiovascular disease mortality for Asian Indians and Filipinos, which might be contributing to sort of this worsening life expectancy and worsening mortality. At the same time, we also see really significant reductions in like smoking rates among Chinese Americans. So, and this is just among men with at least bachelor's degree. Similar pattern. Obviously, people with bachelor's degree have better health in general compared to their non-college educated counterparts. So here, third example here. Now I'm going to sort of the social control criminology type work. And in this study published in 2023, I looked at sort of, I analyzed data from in-depth interviews with Asian descent adults from across the US. And I wanted to see, like how do you sort of experience police interactions? Like how do you think sort of perceptions about your race shape those interactions? And what I found, just sort of broadly speaking, is that for a lot of Asian descent people, there is sort of this divide about who gets perceived as Asian and who doesn't get perceived as Asian. And that has important implications of how they experience policing. So people who said that they are generally perceived as Asian, most often people who are East Asians, talk about, like when I interact with the police, like I don't feel threatened, like the police are treat me with respect, things like that. But for many like South and Southeast Asian respondents, they talked about how like assumptions about Asian people as sort of docile or submissive don't really get applied to them. And so sometimes they might be perceived as Latino, and in some cases they might be perceived as Black. And for them, because of those things, the way they're viewed by the police is very different, right? So some of my respondents talk about, the police being like really disrespectful or threatening them to, deport them and things like that. And a lot of them attribute this to sort of the brownness of their skin, right? And sort of a way to kind of separate who is Asian and who's something else. And then I'll just a final example here, kind of drawing from this idea of like the importance of brownness. Recent study, it's under review now, but I looked at data from the collaborative multiracial post-election survey, and I looked at, okay, so people in interviews said that the brownness of their skin really matters for how they interact with police. So I said, okay, well, what if we looked at, is there some skin color differences in just who gets stopped by the police in the first place? Here, this is, I conducted analysis first at the aggregate level, which is what I showed here, just all Asians kind of combined. And then I also did some stratified analysis to find similar patterns. Basically, what this shows you here is, the darkness of your skin, self-rated skin color darkness. So one is sort of the lightest skin color and tidiness of the darkest skin. And what I found is that, the darker the individual's skin is, the more likely they have been recently stopped and questioned by the police. after controlling for different demographic factors and even sort of delinquent like behavior and delinquent peers and things like that. And so this work kind of aligns with, there's a growing research in criminology talking about some colorism and the influence of that on just contact with the police, but also outcomes of police contact and even sort of punishment by judges. And this another kind of aligns with that, showing us that sort of people with darker features are just more likely to be stopped, they're more likely to be punished, and they're more harshly punished. And there's sort of lighter skin co-ethnics. And so all of the examples that I've given you really kind of speak to this sort of other part of research on socioeconomic sort of race. Is there's this growing talk about like what does it actually mean to be Asian in America? Like is Asian American still a useful sort of category or term to use for research and even just for sort of popular discourse? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's still useful in some cases. If we look at sort of, for example, like political views of Asian group, they do still tend to converge for the most part. So I think like Asian or Asian American is still meaningful in some cases, but I think it's also really important to sort of think about where their experiences might diverge, right? So the book that I showed here, the Latinos of Asians book by Anthony Ocampo, he talks about how Filipino Americans kind of break the rules of race. And he did interviews with Filipino Americans in California. And they talk about how, especially in California, Filipino Americans are often not treated as Asian because they might sort of be treated more like Mexican Americans. And because of long history of like colonialism from Spain and a lot of sort of cultural difference or similarities. This other book, Forever Suspect by Sahir Selach, she talks about sort of the sort of Islamophobia and sort of anti-Muslim sentiment that a lot of people who are South Asians and Arabs and Middle Easterners and people who are perceived as Muslim, regardless of their religion, they also experience a different form of racialization, right? So for a lot of South Asians who are perceived as Muslim, that Muslimness, regardless of their actual religion, kind of matters more than them being Asian or South Asian. So that's sort of, they navigate the world being perceived that way. So, thinking about future directions for researchers, I think there is still so much to unpack about the inequalities that Asian people experience. So one of the key things that I think we should be looking at is the implication of socioeconomic stratification. I think the Pew Research Center's, I think the data from like 2020 or so said that Asian descent people now have sort of the widest gap between the top 10% and the lowest 10% sort of income earners. And then part of this too is that because I noted earlier, there's a sort of migration of people from Asia who will come in as sort of refugees and asylum seekers. The things that we know about sort of selection processes for voluntary migrants don't necessarily apply to them, right? So they're not necessarily positively selected for like education outcomes and things like that. And that has implications for the health outcomes, just sort of how they navigate the US. And then, I noted earlier, things like health stratification. I think because Asian descent people are growing so rapidly, we also need to do more research, sort of the political behaviors and the way they engage, with civic life. What's interesting with Asian descent people is that not only are they the fastest growing people, our racial group in the US, the region where they're growing the fastest is in the southern United States, where we often think about race in terms of Black and white binary. So I think that sort of growing most rapidly there will really sort of change like racial dynamics. There's also, I think, things related to migration patterns. So I think now Asian descent people are the fastest growing undocumented groups in the US. And so I think they're a group that we don't often think about when we think about undocumented migration. There's even like a recent PBS documentary showing sort of mass migration of undocumented people to the southern border, actually from China. So they fly into somewhere in South America or Central America, and then they'll just cross over with other migrants in the southern border. And then lastly, I think this has implications just for sort of how we think about sort of demographic shifts. One big area in like race research, I was thinking about how people self-identify, especially people who are sort of mixed race, right? Does that mean that those people are more likely to identify as Asian or mixed race, or are they more likely to identify as white or Black, or whatever it might be? So I think we can't just assume that just because Asian population is growing that we know that would mean for politics. So to address those questions, these are, I think, really, really useful in the sense they're publicly available for researchers. So the first one at the top is what I used for the skin tone study, the collaborative multiracial post-election survey. It's an ongoing survey. It's nationally representative. We oversample for minority groups, so you can really disaggregate different Asian groups there. Especially for people interested in like political science research and like, political behavior rate survey. They also have a few like health outcomes there. The National Asian American Survey, AAPI data, these are also great resources. NationScape is another sort of really large survey data set that also has a lot of like very large sample of Asians and Asian Americans. Again, very useful for people interested in policy research. And there's some students here, so I wanted to highlight some key resources for students. I always see it's a really great Center for Ethnic Studies and a lot of great scholars who study sort of Asian American literature, history. I think that if you're really interested in learning more about sort of the context of Asian and Asian Americans, it's a really great sort of underused resource. Yeah. And then, so just to add, there are 3 key takeaways that we get from this. First is that Asian descent people have very long history in the United States. As I noted, in 1849, right? And that I hope that I've also shown that sort of this idea of like race is a lot more blurry than we might think. And then lastly, that Asian descent people are not one. So it's important to think about the context, sort of the outcomes of our study. Yeah. Thank you.
We've got great time for questions. Let's open it up for the audience.
So this was awesome, Darwin. Thank you so much. One of the things that I was thinking about is, especially as you're talking about like civic behavior, various like Asian groups, is also like how Asianness gets politicized. And I guess I'm thinking specifically of the recent Supreme Court, what was it? What's the admissions? Yeah, affirmative action. Thank you. Where they were suing on behalf of Asian discrimination, and there was a whole conversation. I think it was like the Gorgeous PA webinar thing where I think Charity actually is now at VCU pointed out that you can link all of this to, if you put it into the ways in which anti-Blackness and whiteness sort of serve as this like spectrum, and then Asianness was being used kind of within that framework. So I just thought that is an interesting thing that your research is making me think about, like behavior, different political behaviors, but then how meaning is made within our political discourse. So I don't know, just.
Oh, that's a great. Actually, related to that, I think it was there was another case that was lobbied against I think it was against Yale also for affirmative action, but I remember because I read about this, and the way they define Asian American and sort of the brief is that they put a footnote that they exclude like Vietnamese and Southeast Asians from their definition of Asian American. Right, because like things like affirmative action were actually helpful for a lot of Southeast Asian groups, especially people coming in from like low SES statuses, right? Their experience of sort of getting access to education is very different than what you might think of for like high SES sort of Asian groups. Yeah. Good.
I just like that historical component was really interesting because I hadn't really thought so much about like the violence against Asian Americans and these stereotypes of like modern minority and how those get, so thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much. I'm just a big fan of the work that you're doing. I'm so excited that you're going to Washington University. I can't wait to see all of the great things that you do there. When you were talking, I was thinking about John Ogden's work on acting white and all of those kinds of things. But I also thought about Lucifer Immerbear's book on the racial order, which discusses how the kind of monolithic portrayals of Asian Americans contributes to, or monolithic portrayals in general, contributes to kind of a reification of the racial hierarchy in ways that are obviously problematic. And so your work to kind of like disentangle, and disaggregate, I think is really, really important. And it also reminds me of how, the nonprofit sector is prone to some of this, because even when I look at work that purports to think about Asian-led nonprofit organizations, I'm still not clear like what is an Asian-led nonprofit organization in some of their work as well. All of that to say, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more, and you've done it a bit, I think, about the implications of this kind of work for other racial groups. So as we sort of dispel the myth of Asian Americans as somehow being kind of the model minority, or individuals who are sort of prone, or not prone, I should say, to some of the same racial disparities that other minorities are prone to. As we kind of sort of peel back the sort of onion for Asian Americans, what are the implications, if any, for how we sort of compare or otherwise think about other racial groups?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It makes me think of, you know, there's also like the race research on like relationality and the relationality rates. Like, and then also, you know, like looking at some of us like tri-racial system, right? So if you like, you know, disaggregate Asian groups, like, well, some of them fall into the collective Black or the honorary whites in relation to other sort of subgroups in the US. But yeah, I think it's like, when I was doing this work, I also really wanted to actually also even think about like how do we disaggregate sort of different sort of subgroups within like the broader Black community in the United States, right? So we also have, you know, migration from Africa and the Caribbean, and their experience is also very different. That has implications for like racial dynamics. Same with like Latina groups. Yeah, so I think taking that relationality perspective is really important. I didn't talk about it here, but that's something that I'm trying to do now, is to really think about sort of the limitation. Like disaggregation is good, but disaggregation is not enough, right? And so we have to think about like new frameworks to sort of better understand like the relationship of how different Asian groups are racialized, also in relation to other people, and you know, vice versa. So I think data disaggregation is like the first step.
Thanks for your talk, that was great. So one of the things that you presented that maybe surprised me the most is the way that you portrayed Asian American people as coming together in solidarity as a movement, right? And that was kind of like at least a choice among movement leaders to create solidarity again across Asian American groups. And it made me think about Spivak's concept of strategic decentralizing, where in movements we choose to essentialize groups in order to create solidarity, to bring power to a movement. And I was just wondering if you could say more about, to what extent do you think that was actually a choice versus like a structural naming and social construction that was imposed upon Asian Americans, whether that was like chosen or not, and then how we might see, while we deconstruct from a research standpoint, is there value in strategic decentralizing for movements?
Yeah, so I mean, the term Asian American was coined by, he was a student, I think at UC Berkeley at the time, then in the 60s, and he became an ethnic studies professor. But the idea was like, at least what the historians will tell us, is that like, the idea of Asian American was really sort of built from like, from within the group, right? So it wasn't necessarily like imposed on them. So I think at that time, sometimes the terms people might use to be like Oriental or Asiatic for some sort of like East Asian groups. But they said, you know, like let's reclaim sort of this identity and maybe form like a pan-ethnic Asian American identity. That was really sort of like a political like act, right? To say that like we are Asian Americans and these are sort of our collective like needs. But there are also people, I think, in like social movements research who will say that even when in the 60s and 70s, when Asian American became like a term that was commonly used, that there were always people who were excluded, at least, you know, so like a lot of South Asians even then would say that like maybe like yes, it's politically useful to be Asian American, but like the way we talk about sort of Asian Americanness often still excludes South Asians and some South Asian or Southeast Asians. And so there's a psychologist, Kevin Nadali, talks about the brown Asian movement and how sort of, being a brown Asian has it's a very different experience than being East Asian. But yeah, I think the term Asian American really comes from sort of within, but then obviously it's led to sort of unintended consequences. Right. And so I think that's why I said earlier, I don't know if we can just say to get rid of the term Asian American, because it is still useful in some cases. I guess we just have to sort of be more aware of the context when it's useful.
This is really interesting. You mentioned one census diagram that had Muslim up there as a category, and I'm just thinking about the role of religion in all of this. And I don't know if there's a parallel kind of history of how kind of different religions have affected the way Asian Americans are treated, or if there's anything there.
Yeah, I mean, so remember, in the 1940 census, they had Hindu as a
Yes,
category.
that's what it was.
Yeah, so Hindu. I think at some point, actually, even in the census, Jewish people were considered Asiatic races. And so we've never had a consistent census since the 1790s. And so religion definitely plays a part of it. So I mean, if you think about it, right, racial groupings and the census is really just about keeping track of boundaries, right? Especially when you really go back to the early parts of the United States, where there was really fears of racial mixing, because that might sort of ruin the purity of certain races, right? And so I think religion was important. And then I think more recently, when we're thinking about South Asians, right? There's some scholars who say that anti-Muslim sentiment, especially experienced by South Asians, didn't start in 9/11. It started before that with the Gulf War. And there was already sort of brewing sentiments that these people are sort of outsiders, and they are here to sort of change the sort of demography of the country. Yeah, so we'll probably continue to see the effect of the change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So obviously very fascinating research in general. I really hope I have the chance to work with you again in the future. I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about the idea of mixed race that you talked briefly about in the presentation, especially given that one of the biggest exciting changes of the next census is that they're going to let people check multiple boxes. So just like to hear more thoughts on that topic.
Yeah. Rob.
Well, I have a similar question. I mean, you mentioned that the vast majority are first or second generations. The challenge of doing this work in another 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
With the demographic changes.
Yeah, that's hard. So even the first example I gave of life expectancies, we had to limit that to people identified as Asian only, because it gets complicated, in how death records are recorded, in terms of people's races. But there's a political scientist here actually at OSU who just gave a talk at Croydon Institute. He talked about how people self-identify, people who are mixed race, how they self-identify. And he talked about there's a lot of different factors that matter, and when people will say that I'm Asian or I'm Black versus identifying as a mixed race. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I think that's a really important topic, especially because actually a lot of Asian groups are really high rates of intermarriage with other racial groups. Yeah.
Plus, because we're measuring this self-identify in the census, right?
Yeah.
So-
Yeah.
So I don't have a question, but rather a comment. I'm just thinking that in public affairs, we have just started to talk about race and ethnicity seriously. I mean, this is an area that is so important that we have not paid much attention to for such a long time, right? And then even within that scholarship, there is just clear absence of Asian Americans or Asians in general, right? And we haven't seen anything in both public administration and in nonprofit work, right? Not much, very little. And with everything that is happening right now with identity politics and all the things that we are seeing, I think this is absolutely important that we pay attention
Makes me think
and expand. Yeah.
representation,
Yeah.
and like, does it make sense? I'm wondering, for somebody with South Asian and we had, for example, in whatever, city council, like you have a Chinese American representing, can you really say that, like I'm being represented? I don't know.
Yeah,
Do people feel that, yeah, like, this Asianness matter more than being South Asian, for example?
yeah, and this clumping people together, right? It's just, yeah, I mean, where do I fit in this conversation? I keep wondering, right? So it's just, and it gets complicated. Particularly like, for instance, if you focus, and you mentioned the South Asians' experiences in this country. I mean, I kept thinking about, like, each time I would fly out, I have to have these conversations in these small rooms, right, that are not terraced, right? So, and they would ask these bizarre questions about, whether I know these people. Right, it's just, and none of that is sort of captured in the PA research, like, how these people sort of experience these things, right? Yeah.
When I flew to Morocco, on a Peace Corps passport, I got taken into a room. And I was like, I have a Peace Corps passport. And they're like, but you're going to Morocco on a one-way ticket. And I was like, to the Peace Corps. Yeah. On a Peace Corps passport. And they were still like, but you're going, but
Yeah.
what is your association there? Like, it was not enough. It was like, why are you going there? And I'm like, with blonde hair and blue eyes and snow white skin wasn't even enough. It was that affiliation. So
Yeah.
See.
Thank you, Darwin.